So, Epic Rap Battles of History is in Season 5, and one of the battles that they did is George R. Martin versus J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, both these men are fantasy writers. However, though, J.R.R. Tolkien won that battle, and I'll tell you why. George R.R. Martin is a uninspired hack. He really is an uninspired hack, because he basically, number one, ripped off the Lord of the Rings series with like the central characters and all that. He ripped off the main characters and all that. And the other thing is, he basically took the Lord of the Rings world and made it more sexualized. That's pretty much all he did. Other than that, he has no original ideas to Game of Thrones. But here's the interesting thing, though. J.R.R. Tolkien and was talking about T.S. Lewis in the rap battle for a brief moment. And why did he mention T.S. Lewis? Well, T.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who are fantasy writers. They're the older generation of fantasy writers. T.S. Lewis is famously known for Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series, and J.R.R. Tolkien is, of course, we know, Lord of the Rings. So, why did he mention T.S. Lewis? Well, T.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are both World War I veterans. So they knew what it was like to be in the trenches of Assad. While J.R.R. Tolkien appropriately pointed out that George R.R. Martin LARPed his way through Vietnam. Means he dodged the draft. And so therefore, whenever he talks about war or battle, he talks about it from a point of view of someone who never fought in war. Of someone who will never understand the pains of being in the middle of the battle and the horrors of being in the middle of the battle. And you can tell that by the works of T.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Martin, by basically looking at battle scenes from Lord of the Rings and Narnia. In Narnia, there's a lot of battle scenes that, if you look into the history of World War I, connect to a lot of the battles. Same thing with Lord of the Rings. A lot of the battle scenes, ironically, represent the experiences of J.R.R. Tolkien in the Battle of Assad. And so, they write about war from someone who's been in war and someone who knows the horrors of being in war. Well, George R.R. Martin writes Jon Snow as like a Vietnam veteran, but he writes it from a standpoint as if he was observing the Vietnam War from the battlefield instead of being in the battlefield. So therefore, George R.R. Martin had, good rhymes in there. But however, though, his work will never be as good as T.S. Eliot or J.R.R. Tolkien, because these fantasy writers are timeless. They're classics. They're recommended reading for people who are into the fantasy series. While George R.R. Martin will only be a cult writer. He will only be a writer for the Game of Thrones audience. That's it. While you don't have to be like a member of the Lord of the Rings or the Narnia universe in order to enjoy the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien and or the writings of T.S. Lewis, sorry. Yeah, you don't need to be a part of those fan clubs in order to enjoy their work, but you have to be a part of the Game of Thrones fan club in order to enjoy and appreciate Game of Thrones. However, though, Game of Thrones, though, is on HBO and gets a lot of audience because due to a lot of the sex scenes. I'm not arguing against sex scenes. I think they enhance movies and all that. However, though, if you're going to tell a fantasy story, an unrealistic fantasy story, you don't need to always have it based on reality. Well, that's what George R. R. Martin does, compared to T.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. While they write based on complete fiction and complete unrealistic situations that can never happen in real life, George R. R. Martin kills off the good characters and bad characters simultaneously, and that's close to real life. It's supposed to be unrealistic. That's the purpose of fantasy. And George R. R. Martin misses that point. And the other point, though, is that a lot of people watch Game of Thrones. I'm talking about a lot of perverted men and women that watch Game of Thrones, not for the storyline, but for the sex scenes. Let's be honest. They watch it for the sex scenes, not the story itself. So therefore, being on HBO, they could get away with the sex scenes and while still please the audience in a different way, if you understand what I'm saying. So therefore, that's why J.R. Tolkien won the battle. Because he wrote about a universe. You don't necessarily need to be a fan of that book universe, but you can still enjoy the writing. You can still understand the story, while you can't understand Game of Thrones unless you're a fan of Game of Thrones. That's my analysis on the epic rap battles of history battle, J.R.R. Tolkien versus George R. R. Martin.